I designed this shoe storage bench and matching coat rack about 4 months ago and planned to make it for my wife for her birthday. And since that's in 5 days, I better get started. There's no time to waste, we're jumping right in on this one. And to add to the challenge, I'm making this entirely from scrap left over from previous projects. But because of that, I'm going to have to pivot right off the bat because this leftover piece of walnut ply was not quite enough to make up the box, which means I need a game plan. My goal for day one is to take all this plywood and get it assembled into the case. So the first step is to start breaking everything down. So what you see me doing here is ripping the plywood to width, but I'm not just cutting one side because I want to maintain the book match in the middle, so I'm taking off 2 strips from each side. And here you can see I have to supplement the walnut with this piece of maple plywood, but it'll make up the bottom so it really won't be visible. And with that cut to width, it's time to cut everything to length. And I'm starting with the ends of the walnut panel, which will become the 2 sides of the cabinet, and the center is going to become the top. But I want to make sure to keep these in order so I can maintain the grain match, so I mark where I want the miters to be so I don't mess anything up. And the trick here is to remove as little material as possible when you make those miters. That way the grain will line up over the edge of the panel. So after setting the saw to just over 45 degrees, I'm going to skim the edge of the board so the blade barely touches the veneer. And on the other side, I bump the fence over just a little bit more because on the bottom, there is no grain match, so it won't matter quite as much. With those done, I'm going to cut the top and bottom pretty much the same way, but with the miter gauge because my fence didn't move far enough away from the blade. But unlike before, I'm stopping short since this offcut will fall down into the throat plate if I let it go free, and I didn't feel like having any kickback today. So instead, I'll just trim this off by hand. And while I do that and do the other side, let me tell you a little bit more about this project. So what you probably don't know about me is I live under some pretty big Douglas fir trees, and that means I'm in a constant battle to keep the needles cleaned up inside. So we hired this robot butler, but it doesn't work with all the shoes on the ground, so this bench will give them a place to go. Or that's the idea anyway. But now that I have all the miters cut, it's time to add the splines. And you might be wondering, what's a spline and why do you need it? It's a piece of wood that runs the length of a joint, which serves 2 purposes. One, it helps keep the 2 boards aligned, and it adds strength to the joint, which is why it's perfect in this application. Since these boxes are made of plywood, I can't afford to have those miters slip during glue up because they can't be sanded flush. That'll ruin the veneer. And since this is a bench, I was worried about the miters busting apart the first time someone sat on it, so the splines will help prevent both of those things from happening. So after making the first pass on all the joints, I used a test piece to fine-tune my second cut until the spline material fit before cutting the rest of the parts. And now you can see a little demonstration of how this works. Now before I can call the structure of this cabinet box done, I need to do one more thing, and that's to make a rabbet along the top and bottom panels. And that's for a support piece that's going to sit in this rabbet that's going to help stiffen up the whole thing, keep it from racking, and give the top a little bit more support so it won't bow when someone sits down on it. And with that, it's time to make a dado that's going to hold the shelf. And anytime I'm making a dado that needs to line up on 2 different parts, I like to cut them at the exact same time. That way, I only have to do one setup, and any error I introduce will be replicated on both sides, which will hopefully cancel themselves out and keep the shelf nice and level, or at least that's the idea. Truth be told, I've messed up these types of cuts before, and the stakes were even higher since I had no extra material if I needed to recut parts, so I was pretty proud when it all worked out. And speaking of no more material, I didn't have enough to make this shelf, but I did have a few scraps that I could glue together and turn into a shelf. Typically, you wouldn't glue plywood together, but in this application, the shelf is not really seen, so it'll work just fine. And while I'm at it, I'm going to put a little edge banding on the bottom support just so that you don't see any of that plywood edge. So here's a little secret that's not actually a secret. If you're in a time crunch and you don't want to have to wait for glue to dry, well, you only really have to wait for about half an hour, according to the back of the Titebond 2 bottle. Which means I could take a lunch break, come back, and keep working on the shelf. So what I'm doing here is trimming off the front of the shelf because it needs to slide past the dado and sit flush to the inside of the walls of the cabinet. To match the square ends of the shelf, I'm squaring off the round corners of the dado which were left there by the router bit. And this is the last piece of construction. After this, I'll do a quick sanding and pre-finish all of the parts on the inside, which is way easier to do when I can lay everything flat rather than trying to shove my hand inside a built cabinet. And with that, day 1 is done.
Today is a new day. Yesterday I worked pretty hard, some long hours. I think I finished up around 10 o'clock, but everything is pre-finished and ready for assembly, which checks off pretty much everything I wanted to do yesterday on my list, except for just gluing up the box, which I will start with today and then do everything else on this list, I hope. I probably won't get through all of it because I have to end my day a little bit early, but it's going pretty fast. So let's get cracking.
So if you couldn't tell, at this point, I was feeling really good, and since I'd already test fit everything yesterday, I knew assembly would be a breeze. Those splines really helped, acting as a second hand holding the box together while I added some clamps. And speaking of clamps, what I'm going to use is a picture frame ratchet strap, which applies even pressure on all 4 corners. It's a great way to clamp up any mitered corner from a picture frame to a box like this, and any tool you see me use that I personally recommend has a link in the description of this video. And if there's not a link, well, either I forgot, so ask me, or I didn't include it for a very good reason. But since I only have one of these, I'm also going to use a regular ratchet strap. But if you're going to go this route, you need something to protect those miters, otherwise you will damage them. Which is why I added those little blocks. And all that's left is to slide the shelf in and add the support pieces, and we're back on schedule. The plan for day 2 is to get all of the hardwood components of the bench done, including the face frame, the base, and veneering the front panel. And that is quite a tall order, but any good project manager does this. They front load the schedule, so if things take longer than anticipated, then there's a little bit of slack at the end. And if things go well, you can finish up early. So let's see what I can get done in day 2. So far, all the lumber is now milled, and I'm going to cut the face frame parts first because I need to glue those on, and I'll have to wait for those to dry before I can progress the box. Now, the wood I'm using here is walnut, and I purchased it back when I bought the plywood, and I don't have too much of this stuff left. See, typically I buy my walnut from a local sawmill because it has some crazy cool color and grain, but when you're using plywood, you want the solid wood to blend in with it, and since plywood walnut veneers are steamed, I needed some steamed walnut too. That steaming process helps even out the colors of the wood and make it all look more uniform, which is why it's done for large-scale manufacturers so their products all match. And it's exactly why I don't typically use this type of wood, because I like all my unique custom pieces of furniture to come from unique custom trees. But I'm using up some scraps and that walnut ply needed to go. But anyways, back to the project, and what I've done so far is cut one miter on the end of the trim so I could put it in place, mark how long it needed to be so I could come back and cut the second side. That way I can sneak up on the fit of all these pieces so the trim sits nice and tight, and then it's as simple as gluing it into place. Unfortunately, that was the end of day 2, and with only 2 things checked off the list, I was falling way behind. So I shuffled the schedule and turned day 3 into my makeup day. With the case ready, it's time to turn our attention over to the base, but I don't always trust my SketchUp measurements and like to take them from the real world before I start. save on time, I milled up all my lumber earlier, and based on my measurements, I ripped everything down, but I'm skipping that process so we can jump straight to the fun part, the joinery. I'm using mortise and tenons for this, which is completely overkill. Dominoes, dowels, or pocket hole screws would work just as well, but I recently had a bad experience with dowels, so I'm avoiding them until that memory fades. Now, when I'm making a mortise and tenon joint, I like to start with the mortises because they will dictate the size of the tenon. So I drilled out most of the waste and then I'm squaring everything off with a chisel. And then I'm going to break out the crosscut sled so I can cut all of the tenons. To make a tenon with the table saw, I like to lay the board flat, use a flat ground blade, and cut all the material away in one pass at a time. I like the results this gives over establishing a shoulder and then standing the board up and removing the face waste. To me, that can get a little bit hairy with longer parts, and this method is always easy and consistent, even though it takes a little bit longer. Now, what I've done so far is used a test piece to see if I was close on my first pass, and it turned out I was cutting way too high, so I backed the blade down a little bit and tried again until I had the piece fitting nice and tight, at which point I can move over to the work pieces, which needed to be trimmed to length. So sometimes a board can get snipe, which is this divot at the end of the board caused by the planer. What happens is the planer can tilt the board on exit or entrance, which causes it to raise one end higher into the cutter head, taking a deeper cutter on that end of the board. And the reason I'm sharing this is because you always want to leave your boards long before milling and then trim them after so you can get rid of any snipe that may have happened. And now that we have the faces of the tenons done, it's time to work on the edges. I prefer to cut these by hand to fit each of the individual mortises because I hand cut the squared ends of the mortises, which means they're all just a little bit different. So this way I can come back, fine tune them all so that they all fit perfect. When I initially put the base together, it felt like it needed a little bit more support, so I'm adding this centerpiece which is going to sit in these two shallow recesses on both sides of the long stretchers. It's probably not necessary, but it'll help keep things square and support the middle of the cabinet. And with that, it's time to work on the part that made me the most excited when I was starting this project. The feet.
Oh yeah.
Okay. So what I'm going to do is add a little round corner to each of these with this Forstner bit. But since I'm drilling off center from the workpiece, I added a support block to help guide the bit so it cuts straight down. And with the first one done, I can flip the foot.
Oh yeah.
Okay, that's enough. Stop it. I had cut all of the semicircles, so I'm going to head over to the bandsaw to cut a taper from the bottom of the semicircle all the way down to the bottom of the foot. Now I thought about taping this piece back on and cutting the other side, but I realized I could just draw the line again and have a flat surface to cut from the opposite side, and now my legs were ready for some cleanup.
Oh yeah.
No, you stop. I said legs, not foot. After sanding the base to get rid of any saw and mill marks, it's time to glue it all together. And you might have noticed that it is once again dark outside. That's because it's almost 9 o'clock at night right now, which is getting pretty darn late. But I have to press on because tomorrow is already day 4, and I have to get the door fit, which means I need to get it veneered tonight. Okay, you got me. So I actually cut these veneers earlier when I was doing all the milling because I had the planer out and it just made sense to do it then. But it didn't make sense to show you this process until now when I'm actually going to get to the veneering. And another honesty moment, I did not plan on veneering this door. I actually wanted to make it out of solid wood, but when I was planning the project and based on my materials I had on hand, I just didn't have enough of that steamed walnut, so I had to improvise. It was either this or I go back and buy more wood, and that I did not want to do. And since this is my first time veneering, and I'm obviously now an expert, I'll share some tips. I cut them at just over 1/4 inch, planed one side of the board that I'm using to cut all the veneers off of, and then cut all 3 veneers until they were done, and then I headed back over to the planer to bring them down to 1/8 inch thick, which is about as thin as you can go without a jig to support these thin boards as they go through the cut. And now we're back at night where I'm cutting down this leftover piece of plywood from my last build where I made a circular terrazzo table. And I'm pausing the cut because that almost caused kickback as that little thin piece was wedged down in next to the blade, and luckily it didn't catch a tooth and shoot back at me. But with that, I have my substrate done and my veneers ready, and it's time to go ahead and put them together. Now, I'm definitely not an expert at this since it's my first attempt, and I don't have access to a vacuum bag, so I'm going to do this the old school way. Well, I guess not that old school since I'm not hammer veneering, but whatever. What I'm doing here is putting pieces of tape across the seam to pull them tightly together, and then I'll follow that up with a piece that goes along the seam that will help keep the glue from squeezing out between the veneers, which could push them apart as clamps apply pressure. Next up is to spread glue all over the plywood surface and in between those veneer seams, but at this point something unfortunate happened.
All right, start of day 4. Last night my camera died while I was working late getting this thing glued up. So I added these cauls and these clamps, distribute all the clamping pressure all the way across, and hopefully everything stuck down nice. I'll find out soon. Today I'm planning on getting this panel ready to go, and then I need to start on the coat rack. So still a long ways ahead of us, and honestly not a lot of time. So I gotta get to work as soon as possible.
So I didn't put any cauls on this end, and you can see the veneers did not stick down very well, but luckily they did everywhere else, and I was already planning on trimming off this end anyway because I had some snipe. So while I clean up the panel and trim it to size, let me share some lessons learned after my first attempt at veneering. First off, if you don't have a nicely tuned bandsaw set up for resawing, you're gonna want to plan for thicker veneers so you can plane off any bandsaw drift you may get. This does turn a little bit more of the material into sawdust, but hey, you're veneering, so you're already stretching your boards anyway. Second thing is, if you don't have a drum sander, you want to plan for thicker veneers. Like I mentioned earlier, 1/8 was as thin as I was willing to go with the planer, otherwise you risk shredding that board. Third, don't just use cauls. I should have put another sheet of plywood or maybe some melamine down on top of the veneers to help spread out the clamping pressure. And speaking of clamps, use more cauls than you think you need. I had just enough, but if this panel was any wider, I would have been in trouble, especially in the middle of the board. And lastly, I heard you should veneer both sides of a panel, and I never knew why, and it turns out it prevents the panel from warping. See, glue shrinks as it dries, and when there's glue only on one side, it pulls all in one direction, causing the panel to bow. But if you put it on both sides, the glue pulls evenly and keeps everything flat. At this point, I didn't want to veneer the backside, so instead I'm going to attempt to use this trim to flatten the panel back out. So this trim was just some offcuts from earlier that I put a little half round on the front, and now I'm going to miter them around the door pretty much exactly the same way as I did the face of the cabinet. And my trick to getting a nice tight miter is to make the first cut off the line and then trim back to the line when you don't have all that waste hanging off the end, which can cause the cut to be a little bit rougher. Plus this way you can sneak up on your final fit, which is really the key to nice tight miters. With that, it's time to glue and clamp these pieces on so I can move on to the next piece to this puzzle. About the time my kids got old enough to walk, they started pulling on the coats on our old coat rack, and it's a little worse for wear. And this is the real reason why I'm making this project. The shoe bench was more my idea because I don't like seeing all those shoes stacked up in the entry. But upgrading the coat rack was what my wife really wanted. And what she wanted was something super sturdy and not freestanding, that way it cannot be pulled over. To satisfy those requirements, I came up with the idea for a piece of wood that had slots in it for some really simple hangers. This way there's no moving parts and nothing to break, with tons of room for coats, bags, and backpacks to hang. So what I'm doing now is making all of the hangers by cutting a bunch of holes in this board. And funny enough, this is actually 48 total hangers, and it certainly doesn't look like it, but what you can see me do is cut the board up into strips, and then what I'll do is come back with a crosscut sled and slice all these pieces into individual hangers. Now with the dado stack installed that's perfectly sized for the hangers, I'm going to cut a bunch of dados in this white oak board. And you'll notice I'm taking one pass, flipping the board around, then placing a hanger as a spacer for the next pass, which gives me equal spacing without the need of doing any measurements that could, frankly, mess the whole thing up. On this pass, you'll notice I'm pushing down pretty hard on the board, and that's because as I cut away the fibers of the wood, it's actually causing some tension to be released in the board, and it's bowing on me. So I'm pushing it down to keep it flat so each dado is the same depth. Now I'm going to glue the hangers in place butt to butt. And what I'll do is I'll take this board, rip it in half, and then get two of this after they're all glued together, but I figured this would save some time and save some clamps. And then I had the bright idea of flipping this whole assembly over. That way I can use fewer clamps by allowing the board to distribute the clamping pressure rather than putting clamps on every single one of these 48 little hangers. With that drawing, we should do a quick time check to see if we're on track for everything planned for day 4. Oh wait, that's not right. Shoot. How did everything slip to the end? Okay, time to speed some things up. Now this door has been in clamps for long enough that I can cut in the hinges. Initially, I wanted to use some Euro style hinges for the door, but after I switched the plan to veneering the panel, I didn't have enough thickness, so I switched it back over to using some butt hinges. And honestly, that was the best decision I made on this entire cabinet. It turns out that the way these hinges nest into the trim is my favorite part of the whole project. So while I cut these mortises, and since you've made it this far, I think it's time I asked you a favor. The first thing I'd appreciate you do is leave me a comment. If you don't know what to say, no worries, I got you. What you can do is just tell me what you liked about the video so far, or what you like about this project. And if there's something you don't like or that's bothering you, put that in there. I'd love to read it and respond, and we can have a little chat about it. Not only does that help out the video, it helps me out learn more about you and what you like about the videos and what you don't like, so I can adjust and make these better next time. Now the next thing is totally optional, but if you want to, you can go check out my Patreon page, and you can even sign up to support me. That helps me continue to make these videos, and I'd love to continue to build out that community. Alright, back to the build. Now that the hinges are mortised into the door, I can put the entire door in place so I can work on the next part, which is to install a soft open mechanism. But at this point, it's getting pretty late, and I'm going to pick this up tomorrow on day 5.
So I opened up the package for this little arm thing to see how it worked, read the instructions, which are confusing as heck. Instead of relying on that, I'm just going to take this over to the cabinet and see exactly how it's going to work and where it needs to go to make sure that it fits. So over here on the cabinet, I want it on this side because that's going to be up against the wall. And I know just based on the angle, it needs to be right in line with the shelf, which immediately I'm like, that's a problem. And then when it closes completely, unfortunately, this little arm sits where the door is. So there's no space for the door because the door actually recesses in here just a little bit. This thing is not going to work. Since today is the last day and I need to get finish on this thing like as soon as possible, I think it's fine if I just put a chain in here that's going to hold this thing open so it doesn't hit the floor. It'll work.
Day 5, and there's still a lot to do. So I'm starting with the coat rack, and I had this bright idea to give the front a gentle curve, and I actually wished I didn't do this because I preferred the square look, but hey, I can't go back now. And with that done, I can cut the whole thing in half, and now I have 2 of them, and this should be pretty much ready for finish. At some point along the way, I chipped the veneer in the corner of the plywood, and now it's time to patch it before finish. Luckily, I had some offcut from the plywood before, so I created a little square which fit right in there. And with that, this thing is ready for finish.
So we made it install day, which is day 6. So things I need to do, first off, this patch that I made, I wasn't super happy with. So I'm gonna go ahead and change that out and then install the door, install the handle, install the chain, install the base, and then put the coat racks in place inside. And it's done.
So technically I'm out of time, but my wife has to leave the house in a couple hours anyway, so I have a little bit of time before she leaves before I can put it all inside anyway. So it all worked out. Now this patch. I was being lazy with the first one and I knew it wasn't going to look good with those square corners, but I went with an easy option and now I get to pay for it. The second patch has a much more natural shape with that long tail and it's going to help blend it into the surrounding wood. On the plus side, I used a hard wax oil finish, which is easily repairable, so I can just sand this one spot down and apply new finish and you'll never know it was there. Now I finally get to put the whole thing together starting with the base. And this is really pretty easy since I don't have to worry about wood movement since this is plywood, so it just sinks some screws down through the bottom and that's done. And then the next bit is to put the door pole on the door before I install the door. Oh, yeah, I made a door pole at some point. Installing hardware is always a bit tricky, so for this one I decided to just put the pole in place and then figure out where I was going to drill some pilot holes, then put some screws in, just poking out so I can mark the back side of the pole, pre-drill the pole, and then install the whole thing. And the last thing to do is to put the door on and install a few extra bits that go with it, like this magnetic catch that I didn't realize I needed until now because the arm I was going to use was supposed to hold the door closed. But now that I'm not using that, the door will fall open and I don't want that to happen. So rather than using 2 magnets, I'm actually using a screw on one side so I can adjust the fitment just a little bit. And then the magnet goes on the inside of the cabinet. And of course, the last thing to do is to put on the chain.
All right, my wife just left and took the kids. They're gonna be gone for about an hour, so I don't have a lot of time, but this thing's ready to go inside and I need to get the coat racks installed right now. So I'm gonna go do that and then I'll carry this in.
I prefer not having any visible fasteners, so I'm going to use keyholes, which means I first need to find the studs and sink some screws into the wall. With that done, I can now determine where the keyholes need to be cut by placing the coat racks directly on those screws and marking their locations. The next step is to carry my mark onto the back side of the coat rack and drill a hole where I want the keyhole to start. Now you don't necessarily have to do that if you want to use a plunger router, but I'd prefer to use a smaller router for this, so I needed a spot to drop the bit into. And just like that, the keyholes are cut. Now, I really like to use these because you can fine-tune the fit to the wall when you use a tapered screw. See, you can just drive the screw a little bit deeper into the studs, and that taper of the screw is going to help suck your whole assembly into the wall and keep it nice and tight. Now, my wife's a little camera shy, so no surprise reaction face from her, but I'll sum up what this build really means. This was a gift, and the value of a gift isn't the money spent, but the time and effort that went into the giving. And this entry upgrade represents 5 days of building at a breakneck pace, and in the end, it's exactly what she wanted. Well, that's it. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you on the next one.